Hey, John Casey here, Washington State, Casey's Bail Bonds. Saying, really, what is a bail bondsman? Bail bondsman is in lieu of having the actual bail amount required by the proper authority at the time, arresting officer, the jail, and everybody that is superseded is the courts. They require a penal sum. In some instances, it could be a very nominal amount. The courts may assume you're not flight risk, but you know what? Potentially you're not going to address these court appearances or potentially go pick up new charges or a variety of other reasons. But primarily, bail is for the assurance that somebody is going to fulfill their necessary court appearances. Courts require bail. You can put up the full penal sum as the judge directs, or you can use an alternative. In lieu of the individual, the principal sitting in custody, the bondsman in Washington State is going to charge typically around 10%. Not meaning that the full 10% is collected up front. However, whatever is negotiated on paper will reflect a 10% fee to lend the indemnitor the promissory amount for the penal sum. Say in instance, someone does go to custody and it's a $5,000 bail. We'll use a $5,000 bail in this example. My friends, my loved ones, my daughter doesn't have $5,000 to give to the courts at this operational hour or the jail during non-business hours. She would contact, or my loved one will contact a bail bondsman. A bondsman is going to probably inherently look at the risks, note any failures to appear in the past, any reason why they would not want to be suspect to this bond amount if an individual does miss court. So considering all the factors, the bail is underwritten and secured with the courts. Now the bail bondsman has just secured the individual's release. So each and every time they go to court, the principal, it's assumed that the individual is still sitting in custody. But, you know, technically they're not. So in lieu of them sitting in custody to address their necessary requirements to the courts, abide by court orders, don't miss court appearances, make sure that the courts know where you are at all times, you update your records, your physical address with them. You fulfill all your necessary obligations. The bondsman, the surety, will not be obligated for the penal sum of the bond to the courts. However, should the principal decide to interrupt the court proceedings and or pick up a new additional charge outside of the county that they originally were posted the bail bonds, the indemnitor and the surety could be subjected to the full penal sum of the bond for the inconvenience they created to the courts. So a bondsman can remedy themselves by contractually hiring out a recovery agent, or inherently, if they are the qualified agent, they could themselves bring the individual back to the jail that they secured the release for the proper court that the bail bonds is reflected upon. Or sometimes some judges do acknowledge the fact that you could bring the individual to the courts and present them in a courtroom setting when acknowledged, and sometimes a warrant will be served upon that individual at that time. But different courts have different procedures. The bail bondsman charging 10% of the penal sum, guaranteeing appearances. Some of them are monitoring the principal's behaviors, having the principal check in occasionally, and it's a good follow-up. The bail process is for the stakeholders. You, the stakeholder, the taxpayers, the courts, the state, who has to handle the caseload. It is that big insurance policy to include that everything that is responsible upon that principal is inclusively taken care of. Don't miss court, don't pick up new charges, and let the courts know you're taking this seriously, and that's the bondsman's presence to the taxpayers, to the courts, to the state. It's costing them zero, as opposed to somebody being detained customarily for 3-5 days at $80 a shake. It starts to add up. Deterrent-wise, and you're going to find a lot of different statistical approaches which are grossly skewed. But when somebody does meet bail, either the posting of the full penal sum or the securement of a surety, they are more than likely have a lesser recidivism as opposed to somebody who was released on their own promise to appear or own recognizance. Each and every time a warrant is issued, customarily, some people stay out for about 2 years on average warrant. When they do get picked up, it's typically costing the taxpayers about $1,500 for law enforcement to intervene, for the jail to house them, to use their time and abilities to get the state, the prosecutor's office, back on track to where the case was, for the courts to try to figure out where they are with due process and the individual rights. So at the end of the day, behind the scenes is the bondsman. And the bondsman is the one that's alleviating the tax burden. You find in most jurisdictions, the retail bondsman is just a one-man, two-man operation who has very good relations with the taxpayers and the courts. Seldom do you really find a big retail company in bail, just because you have to have your fingers not only on your employees, but you also have to have that psychological presence on each and every client that you bail out, because each and every case is handled differently, entirely. Some people just simply aren't motivated to address their issues with the courts. But the bondsman not only is acting like counselor, jailer, therapist, any other designated hat that you can conclude to make sure that the safeguard of the community is in place and that the risk is not imposed on the taxpayers, that the individual addresses their court appearances and obligations. Should you want me to explain more, give me a holler. John Casey, Casey Bail Bonds, 360-874-7568.